It was a rainy night when she received the letter. There was no return address, just a message written on aged paper that seemed like it was pulled straight from an old book. She picked it up, her trembling fingers brushing against the cold paper, and felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease as she read the carefully handwritten words. You have been chosen to take part in a one-of-a-kind event, a ritual that transcends time and space. Respond to this invitation, and you will witness what few have the privilege of seeing. That was all it said. No further explanations, no extra details. An enigmatic invitation, but an irresistible one. That same night, she felt something different inside her, a sense that this invitation wasn't just an opportunity, but a destiny, a chance to explore the unknown. What could be more fascinating than uncovering mysteries that defy human understanding? She had always been drawn to the occult, to what hides in the shadows, far from the sight of others. And now, she had been chosen. Anxiety consumed her, but her curiosity pushed her forward. She replied immediately, without hesitation. A simple message, but full of longing. I'm ready. The days that followed passed in a blur, and soon the day of the ritual arrived. She was instructed to show up at a remote location, far from any civilization, where nothing could interfere with what was about to happen. The description of the place seemed vague, but there was something about it that drew her in. She had no doubt she needed to go there. She traveled for hours until she finally arrived. The place was an old mansion on the edge of a dense forest, where the darkness seemed to swallow any trace of light. There was no sign of life, except for the sound of the wind slicing through the trees. The atmosphere was oppressive, the air thick with an ancient, unfathomable mystery. As she stepped inside, the smell of mold and age would overwhelm her senses. The mansion was poorly lit, with only candles scattered across the walls, casting shadows that danced and twisted as if they had a life of their own. She felt disconnected from the outside world, as if she were in another time, another reality. For a moment, doubts crept in, but it was too late to turn back now. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. As she walked down the hallways, she came across other participants, but something inside her knew they weren't like her. Their faces were expressionless, as if they were present, yet distant at the same time. Each one seemed more like a puppet than a person, their gazes empty, their bodies rigid. They turned to watch her as she entered the main room, but no one moved or made a sound. The tension in the air grew thick. Something was wrong. An imposing figure approached her. He wore a black cloak that covered his body, but it couldn't hide the piercing eyes that watched her with an unsettling calm. Without saying a word, he raised his hand, gesturing for her to sit with the other participants. The ritual was about to begin, and then he spoke, his voice deep and almost whispering, filling the room with a disconcerting authority. This is not an event like any you've witnessed before. The rules that govern this ritual are absolute, and you must follow them, or you will suffer the consequences. He paused, allowing the words to sink into her mind, slowly absorbing the weight of what he had just said. The rules are simple, but they must be followed without fail. The first, do not look into the eyes of the person next to you. The second, during the ritual, silence will be your only language. Do not speak, no matter what happens. If someone disappears, do not search for them. And the last, never, under any circumstances, attempt to leave the place. The woman swallowed hard, her breath quickening. This isn't what I imagined, she thought. But before she could question or protest, the cloaked figure raised his hands and snuffed out the candles around the room. The The space was swallowed by absolute silence, and a feeling of dread wrapped around her like an icy cloak. Now she understood. What was about to happen was much more than just a ritual. The rules weren't mere formalities. They were the key to her survival. As the lights went out and the darkness consumed the room, she realized there was no turning back. The air in the room became thick, as if the very atmosphere was being compressed by invisible forces. The woman tried to stay calm, but the rules echoed in her mind like a persistent whisper. Don't look into the eyes. Don't speak. Don't search. Around her, the other participants remained motionless. No sound, no movement, just a palpable tension that seemed to grow with every passing second. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. The figure in the center of the room raised his hands once more, and somehow the air grew even heavier. He didn't need to speak for her to know that the ritual had begun. The space around her seemed to bend, as if time itself was being distorted. Everything went utterly silent. The woman tried to focus, concentrating on her breathing, on how to stay calm. But the other participants, she felt their eyes on her. And it wasn't just any gaze. It wasn't curiosity nor interest. It was a presence, as if their minds were being pulled into a vortex, a sensation of being watched so deeply it went beyond the physical. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, coming from nowhere. The candles, which had been extinguished before, reignited spontaneously, their flames flickering as if they were souls trying to escape. The light wavered, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The woman could no longer tell what was real and what was a product of her panic-stricken mind. Then, something changed. The walls began to emit a strange sound, as if the very building was moving, creaking and groaning under an invisible weight. She felt the ground tremble slightly, but no one moved. No one reacted. She glanced around, following an unspoken rule. Don't look into the eyes of the person next to you. But the other participants, in their deep silence, began to twitch ever so slightly, as if they were in a trance. Their faces held an empty expression, but their bodies trembled, almost imperceptibly, as though they were on the brink of yielding to something dark and indescribable. The woman was tense, fighting the urge to break the rule and look directly at them. The need to understand what was happening, the fear of the unknown, was almost unbearable. But she held firm. She would not look. Then, the leader of the ritual spoke again, his voice deeper than before, as though it was echoing from within the earth itself. The second rule now takes effect. Silence will be upheld. Whatever you hear, make no sound. Whatever you see, do not speak. No matter what happens, do not speak. It was a clear command, and she felt her throat tighten. The words echoed in her mind, like an unbearable weight. Every breath felt like an effort. The sound of the rain tapping on the windows now seemed distant, irrelevant, as if time itself had slowed down. Everything around her felt heavier. The leader raised his hands again, and the candles around the room began to glow with an unsettling intensity. That's when something started to materialize in the center of the room. A thick mist, black as pitch, rose from the floor as if the very space was tearing open. The sight of the mist was hypnotic, yet at the same time, it brought an indescribable sense of dread. And there, in the fog, something took shape. Someone, a humanoid figure, with eyes deeply black and lifeless. The woman froze. She knew she shouldn't speak, but the image before her was too much. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was paralyzed. The figure in the center of the room seemed to be watching the participants with a morbid calm, and the leader, still in silence, gestured for everyone to follow the next rule. Do not search. The woman fought against the urge to look at the figure, against the impulse to understand what was happening. But there was no denying it. The presence of the figure was overwhelming. It was part of something greater, something that made her feel as if the room itself was closing in on her. Fear took over her body. and the feeling that something terrible was about to happen became unbearable. She glanced at the other participants, but their eyes were fixed on the void in a petrified resignation. That's when she heard a sound. It was a whisper, but it wasn't human. It was something more distant, something that seemed to come from within the walls. She tried to focus on ignoring it, but the sound began to grow clearer, more distinct. "Help us." The hissing voice came from some dark corner of the room, and the woman couldn't help it. She tried to follow the rules. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't search. But the impulse was too strong. Her eyes moved, and for a second, she locked eyes with another participant. What she saw made her stop. The person stared at her, their eyes hollow and their smile twisted. It wasn't a smile of peace, but a smile of desperation. In that moment, she understood that something was terribly wrong, far worse than she could have imagined. But before she could react, the room darkened completely, and the sound of the voice disappeared, replaced by absolute silence. She was alone in the darkness, not knowing what to expect. The ritual hadn't ended. She was in the midst of it, and the rules, they were just beginning to be tested. The darkness overtook the room so completely that the woman felt as though her very soul was being absorbed by the absence of light. She could barely make out the outlines of the walls, the other participants, or even her own breath, which seemed muffled by the thick mist that enveloped the place. The silence was absolute, but there was something else in the air, something tangible, something she couldn't identify. She wanted to scream, but she knew she shouldn't. The second rule wouldn't allow it. It was a constant, crushing reminder in her mind. Don't speak. Don't speak. Don't speak. But the words of the hissing voice still echoed in her thoughts. Help us. Who had spoken? It was a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the building itself. A voice that didn't belong to any of the participants. She swallowed hard, feeling the terror grow inside her, like a constant pressure on her chest. And then something moved. A low, dragging sound came from somewhere in the corner of the room. The noise of something being dragged across the floor. She froze. The other participants, still trapped in their deathly silence, didn't move, didn't show any signs of awareness. But she knew something was coming closer. The fear intensified. She couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was drawing nearer to her, closer and closer. It was as if an invisible shadow was stretching toward her, about to touch her, about to consume her. She felt that if she looked at what was happening around her, her mind might snap into panic. That's when she heard a low laugh. Not a human laugh, but one that seemed to come from a distant place, beyond logic. A laugh that echoed off the walls, cut through the heavy air, and invaded her mind. It was a laugh of desperation, of madness. She knew, without a doubt, that she shouldn't react. She couldn't seek the source of that sound, nor could she look around. But the urge was too strong. She looked at the other participants. Their faces were pale, almost transparent in the candlelight. But there was something more. The shadows cast around them weren't on their bodies, but beyond them, as if something else was consuming their figures. Something dark, something distorted, was growing as she watched them. It was as though the room itself was coming alive, as if the rules had been more than simple orders, but rather the chains that kept something far more terrible at bay. She looked toward the leader of the ritual, but he was no longer there. The emptiness of the space around her swallowed her whole. He had disappeared, leaving only a vague sense of his presence behind. Panic spread in her chest, but she forced herself to maintain control, remembering the most important rule: do not seek. Then, the sound of laughter grew louder. It no longer came from a specific direction. Now, it was everywhere, around her, behind her, inside her. She could feel the laughter reverberating in the bones of her body, as if each laugh was tearing pieces of her sanity away. The dark mist thickened, becoming suffocating and oppressive. She couldn't breathe properly. She couldn't see. She couldn't understand. And then she felt it, a presence behind her. She dared not turn her head. She couldn't. If she looked, she would break the rule. But she could feel the pressure, as if someone was there, just inches away, watching her with an intensity that pierced her skin and dug into her mind. The heat of an invisible body, almost tangible. The laughter suddenly stopped, leaving a chilling emptiness. And it was in that absolute silence that the woman heard the whisper, soft as the breeze on a moonless night. "You're getting closer and closer to breaking the third rule." It was a voice that seemed to come from within her head, a seductive voice, yet full of implicit threat. The woman felt her heart race, her body frozen in terror. The third rule. She knew what it was. The last and darkest one. Never, under any circumstances, attempt to leave a location. She wanted to flee. She wanted to run to the doors, tear down the windows, escape that cursed place. But she knew she couldn't. Something held her there. Something far stronger than she could comprehend. The fear of breaking the rule and consequently facing whatever would come afterward kept her frozen, too terrified to make a single move. Suddenly, the sound of wind began to howl, a low wail that seemed to come from within the walls. Something was coming. Something was getting closer. The woman tried to force herself to remember the instructions. Don't look, don't speak, don't search. But she could no longer deceive herself. Something was happening around her, something so horrible and incomprehensible that if she made one wrong move, it would all be over. But the sounds around her started to take on a more concrete form. The laughter, the pressure, the shadows, the vanished leader. The ritual was just beginning to show its true face. She was trapped, and there was no going back now. The whisper still echoed in her mind, like a cruel reminder that any mistake, any attempt to escape, could mean the destruction of her sanity. The air around her was dense, and the feeling of being watched had intensified. She couldn't move anymore. She didn't want to. Fear had paralyzed her, frozen her in a place where the only thing left was the expectation of what would come next. Then, as if a command had been given, the candles that lit the room began to extinguish one by one, as if they were being blown out by invisible hands. The darkness grew thicker, deeper, until it seemed to swallow everything around her. The outlines of the other participants began to disappear into the fog, their bodies turning into nothing more than indistinct shadows. She tried not to look, but the need to understand, to know what was happening, was becoming unbearable. The rules were clear, but something inside her made her question if there was still a chance to escape. It was as though the very environment was closing in around her, like she was being swallowed by an invisible, growing force. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It was a crack, followed by another, like the sound of something breaking, a muffled but horrifying sound, like someone's bones being twisted. Fear surged through her like a hot wave in her veins. She glanced quickly to the side, her eyes locking onto one of the participants. The figure was folded in an impossible way, as if its body had been forced to bend at an angle that shouldn't have been possible. The woman felt her stomach turn, but she couldn't look away. The figure slowly lifted its head, its eyes now completely black, void of light, void of life. It was no longer human. It was something pretending to be a body, but no longer a living being. The silence in the room was broken by another sound, now louder, more present, something moving on the floor, something approaching. She felt pressure, like the very space around her was tightening. The deformed figure she had seen before rose, dragging itself across the floor, its black eyes glowing with an absurd intensity, as if searching for something in her. The woman tried to push away the thoughts, but her mind was overtaken by a single thought. I need to get out of here. But she couldn't. She couldn't look. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. The shadows began to spread across the room, an evil presence taking shape and expanding. Something that had been waiting, something feeding off fear, anguish, confusion. The room seemed to be distorting, the walls twisting, moving, as if they were made of living flesh. And she knew, without a doubt, that the ritual had reached its peak, that the rules were more than just guidelines. They were the key to something much darker, something she couldn't fully understand. A scream echoed through the darkness. It wasn't one of pain. It wasn't one of fear. It was a voice, but not a human voice. It was like a distant whisper, coming from a tortured throat, trying to communicate through the darkness. The woman wanted to scream, but she couldn't. The sound of the voice invaded her mind, and she heard the words clear, as if they were a command. Don't leave. Don't search. If you break the rule, it will all end. Terror took over her. She knew the final rule was about to be tested. The consequences of disobedience were clear, but the rules were becoming vague. The boundaries between what was allowed and what wasn't were blurring. She no longer knew what was real. She no longer knew what was fear and what was reality. It was as if an invisible force was pushing her toward an abyss with no return. She glanced once more at the other participants, trying to understand what was happening. They were starting to move, but not normally. Their bodies were no longer the same. They were changing, transforming before her eyes, as if being consumed by a supernatural force. The woman shut her eyes, trying to block the sight, but the vision that came to her mind was even more terrifying. She saw the leader of the ritual. He was standing, but his body was distorted, his arms and legs stretching into grotesque shapes. His face was covered by a black mask, but the mask began to crumble, revealing a creature with deep-set eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth, as if it was made of nightmares. The vision was quick, a flash, but the woman knew, deep in her being, that she had witnessed something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. And at the same moment, the final rule she had still been trying to keep distant was tested. Never, under any circumstance, try to leave the place. She was about to break the final rule. She knew it. Panic consumed her, but at the same time, something else pushed her forward. She could no longer tell the difference between fear and courage. She knew there was no way out of this anymore. The ritual wasn't just a physical test. It was a mental prison, a trap that tightened more and more with every attempt to escape. Then, in one last act of desperation, she looked at the door. The final rule, the last rule, and the darkness in front of her seemed to grow even denser, more suffocating. And she knew it was too late. Her gaze was fixed on the door. The last chance to escape. The only path to freedom, or at least what she believed was freedom. But the room around her was transforming, and every passing second seemed to increase the weight of what was about to happen. The ritual, the rules, the darkness, everything closed in around her, like a knot tightening around her throat. She knew that if she tried to go to the door, if she broke the rule, it would all end. Whatever was happening in those shadows, whatever was spreading among the deformed bodies of the other participants, would reveal itself. Something much older and more horrific was feeding off her anguish, the growing fear that consumed her, and she could feel it getting closer. The creature that once seemed like a fleeting vision was now more present than ever. Her mind couldn't process what was happening. Her eyes were fixed on the door, but her mind was screaming to look around, to notice what else was moving in the shadows. The leader of the ritual, or whatever was left of him, was now standing still, but his eyes glowed with a supernatural intensity. They seemed to dive into her soul, as if searching not just for her flesh, but for her essence, her very sanity. But she couldn't look. The third rule, the final one: never, under any circumstance, try to leave the place. The air seemed thicker, the weight of the room crushing her ribs, her legs trembling. She felt like the door was only a few steps away, but it seemed as distant as the sky. Every movement she made her feel an invisible force pulling her back, as if reality itself was distorting around her. She wanted to run, but her body was in shock. The fear was so deep that her own existence seemed to doubt itself. The laugh she had heard before returned, this time clearer, closer. She knew it wasn't just a distant echo. It was a laugh of something approaching, something feeding off fear, something watching her and waiting for the right moment to act. A sharp pain shot through her chest, a sense of irreplaceable loss. It was as if something was being torn away from her, as if each heartbeat was an eternity and, at the same time, a breath of life that was fading. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to control the feeling that reality was breaking apart around her, trying to ignore the pressure that made her want to scream, but at the same time, doing everything she could to remain silent. Then, in the middle of that emptiness, a voice. The same voice she had heard at the beginning of the ritual, but now it was clearer, closer, as if it was coming from inside her own mind. "You know what must be done." She didn't answer. She couldn't. The words burned her mind like a spark, a fire threatening to consume everything. She knew what it meant. She knew the ritual wasn't just an experience. It was a choice between living or succumbing to an eternity of torment. Every part of her being begged her to break the final rule, to flee. But something inside her also knew that escaping wouldn't mean salvation. She looked at the others, those distorted bodies, those black eyes, that terrible presence that seemed to expand as she approached the door. They were no longer human, not anymore. And somehow, she understood, they had been consumed by the ritual, just like she was being consumed. But there was something in her chest pushing her to take a step, a movement. She didn't know what would happen if she tried to escape, if she broke the final rule. Maybe all of it was real. Maybe there was no turning back. But she couldn't take it anymore. She was on the edge of an abyss of fear and pain, and the only thing she knew was that, if she didn't try, she would stay there, being swallowed by that nightmare, until her own spirit faded away. She took the first step toward the door. The room twisted. The shadows around her grew thicker, denser. Something screamed. Not a human voice, but a primal, bestial scream coming from the depths of something ancient and evil. The woman felt her mind start to tear apart. She knew reality was unraveling around her, and that, by making this move, she had made the final decision. There was something in the space around her that was no longer a room. It was a tunnel, a passage to another dimension. And when she reached the door, something stopped her. It was an invisible force, a pressure so intense that her bones felt like they were about to break. She tried to scream, but no sound came from her mouth. Her vision started to blur, and the darkness overtook her field of view. She felt as if she was being dragged back to the center of the room. The shadows, the screams, the threatening presence. Everything seemed to be moving, spiraling, pulling her downward. And then one last vision. The leader of the ritual, now completely distorted, his face deformed and covered by a mask of pure darkness, reached out to her. And in that gesture, she knew. The final rule wasn't a warning. It was a fate, a sentence. She had been chosen, and there was no way out anymore. The pressure on her body increased. She felt the gravity of the room, of the space around her, as if reality itself was falling apart in pieces. Every inch she tried to move toward the door felt like an invisible force was pulling her back to the center of that cursed room. Her muscles were tense, her body refusing to move. The air was heavy, charged with an electricity that made her skin crawl. The leader, or whatever was left of him, watched her with a predatory intensity, his deep black eyes fixed on her. The mask of darkness covering his face was a distorted sight, formless, just a blotch of emptiness. He extended his hand toward her, and the gesture seemed more like a summons than a simple movement. It was as if he was invoking something much greater, much more powerful, and she was being drawn into the center of it all. She tried to resist, tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. The sound was stuck in her throat, as if the room itself was swallowing her. There were no more words to express what she was feeling. The fear, the anguish, the desperation. Everything was becoming an impenetrable mass of darkness and pain. And then, like a lightning bolt tearing through the sky, she felt it. It was a physical sensation, something she could touch if she were able to see. The presence of something beyond reality, something that didn't belong to that place, yet was deeply rooted in those shadows. It was as if the very walls of the room were alive, pulsing with an evil energy, and with each breath, Another part of her soul was being absorbed. The leader's hand came closer. He was almost touching her face now. And in that moment, she saw, the darkness surrounding him wasn't just a shadow. It was an abyss, a bottomless pit opening into the void, and the leader wasn't just a figure. He was the emissary of something much older, an entity that had no name, that had never even been conceived by the human mind. It was fear itself, the personification of that which could not be explained. She knew she had failed. She knew that by trying to break the final rule, she had sealed her fate. But, looking at the hand reaching toward her, something inside her still rebelled. Something inside her screamed in protest, not for the life that was about to be consumed, but for the idea of completely submitting to that force. The door, the exit, the act of fleeing, it all seemed so distant now, so unreachable. But, even knowing it was too late, she looked back. And that's when something worse happened. The room, which had once seemed static, now stirred like a living organism. The walls trembled, the floor rumbled, and the darkness expanded, as if the very space was trying to swallow her. The leader smiled, or at least, that's what she thought was a smile, with an empty, emotionless expression. He was no longer a person. He was no longer human. He was personified emptiness, a distorted reflection of what reality should be. His hand finally touched her face, and the impact was like an electric shock, a deep jolt to her mind. She felt her consciousness waver, as if she were being pulled out of herself, like a puppet with no strings. And in that moment of weakness, she heard the last thing she wanted to hear. Now, you will be part of this. You are part of the ritual. You are part of what has always been here. The voice echoed in her head, but it wasn't a human voice. It was a collective whisper, a crowd of distorted voices, intertwined and confused, as if they came from a place beyond time and space. The leader, or whatever was left of him, withdrew his hand. But she didn't feel relief. There was no relief. Instead, she felt an overwhelming weight, as if an invisible pressure were crushing her chest. What was happening here wasn't just a punishment. It was a transition, a transformation. The rules of the ritual were complete, and she had been chosen, not to die, but to become part of something much bigger, much deeper. The room was now empty, but not in a normal sense. The shadows, which had once been just a background, were now alive, stretching out, twisting like serpents. They swallowed her, not physically, but spiritually, absorbing her essence. She no longer knew who she was, whether it was truly her or she had already been consumed, but she felt deeply that her identity was being erased, dissolved by something nameless. And then she knew she could never go back. She would never be herself again. The woman wasn't just being absorbed by a ritual. She was becoming part of what the ritual invoked. She would become one of those shadows. She would become the darkness. The fear she had felt would consume her from the inside out, until there was no trace of her humanity left. She had been taken. The ritual was complete. And now, she would be part of it forever. The emptiness enveloped her. And, in her last moment of clarity, she knew that before her soul vanished, whatever was left of her would now become a story that would be told. And that someday, someone, perhaps, would find the place where the ritual began. The emptiness was dense, like a dark mist closing around her consciousness. She didn't know if she was still conscious or if she had been erased in some irreversible way. But somehow, she knew the cycle hadn't ended. She was no longer just a woman in search of an insane desire for something she didn't understand. She had become something more, an entity now inhabiting a space beyond human comprehension. She felt her being, or what was left of it, floating in limbo. Her form was no longer physical, but a presence, a vague memory of who she once was. But as time stretched on, or what she understood as time, she felt a distortion, a reflection of something familiar. It was the same feeling she had when she was about to escape, when she still thought there was a chance. But now, there was no escape. The rules had been fulfilled. She was part of the ritual, and the ritual was eternal. In the oppressive silence that surrounded her mind, she heard something. Not words, but a sensation. Something deep and ancient. It was as if the room itself, the presence that had drawn her there, was alive, watching her, waiting. She tried to focus, to understand, but everything was fragmented, scattered. A mass of memories and shadows, where time seemed to dilute any notion of continuity. She still felt the leader's touch on her face, the sensation of his presence dissolving into her skin. And then, something materialized, not in physical form, but as a distorted echo of an image. She saw or felt the shadows around her moving, transforming into something more. The distorted silhouettes, the bodies that had once been human, were now in an uncomfortable position, as if they were waiting. And then she realized she was not alone. The cycle of the ritual wasn't just about her. With every soul that passed, a new era began. A new soul was brought into that very same room. She was now part of something much larger, something collective, a network of beings consumed by that space of darkness, of pain. And as more souls arrived, the room became denser, more cramped, until, like a sponge being squeezed, it would feel the need to be filled once more. The idea of escape disappeared. The door, that last symbol of hope, no longer existed. There was no way out. She realized that the ritual fed on the cycle. It was like a great wheel, spinning endlessly, with participants who, with each round, were consumed, and their essences became part of what the ritual created. The lost souls intertwined, dissolved, and new ones came to repeat the steps. But there was something more, something that made her want to resist. Something she had felt before, and now seemed closer, more tangible. A sense that there was still a choice. Not a choice to return, but a choice about how her presence would affect everything around her. She didn't know how, but something inside her still wanted to fight. Wanted to understand the purpose of this place, this eternal curse. So, she did what no one had done before. She looked inside herself, into the depths of the abyss that now filled her. And it was in that moment that she heard a voice. It was no longer the leader's voice, nor the distorted voices that had consumed her. It was a softer voice, almost maternal. You can change the course. You can be the key. She didn't know what that meant. But somehow, she felt that something had been awakened. Something that didn't belong to the ritual. Something bigger than fear, bigger than darkness. In the silence that followed, she understood. There was no going back to the physical world. But maybe there was a way to alter the rules of this place. She didn't need to be just another lost soul in the cycle. She could break the wheel, disrupt the cycle, and perhaps, just perhaps, free the other souls trapped here. But to do that, she would need to understand the true essence of the ritual, to discover who or what commanded it. She didn't know if she could resist the overwhelming power of this distorted reality. But one thing she knew, her fight was far from over. She would no longer be a mere spectator, a passive victim of something she didn't understand. No, she would fight to understand and, if possible, reverse what had happened. The ritual cycle was still in motion, but she now had a mission that would transform her, shape her in ways she could never imagine. She would no longer be just a victim. She would be a crucial part to finally interrupting the ritual, the darkness, and the pain. Or it would destroy her completely. The battle was yet to begin, and the woman, now a shadow among shadows, began to search for the key.